Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the President's house, it's the people's house. Ever since our founding, the United States has been a startup nation. In particular, the White House has been a platform for innovation, where presidents and first ladies have helped inspire the country by exhibiting fearless leadership.
Betty Ford is often not talked about as one of those iconic first ladies. And Betty Ford developed breast cancer while she was first lady. And we have to remember the time. It wasn't something that was talked about. It was almost a taboo subject. But she was very open about what she was going through. And then she encouraged the following generations and women across America to get screened for breast cancer. The importance of that kind of leadership from a first lady is often sort of underappreciated, and I just think she really transformed things. But also, I think her fearlessness in dealing with her own problems of addiction and alcoholism after she left office, and at a time when it wasn't so popular for first ladies to be outspoken in that way. So in many ways, she was just fearless and ahead of her time.
Stuart McLaurin talks to Jean Case, CEO of the Case Foundation and a member of the board for the White House Historical Association, about how the White House and its occupants have helped shape our nation through fearless leadership.
Welcome back to the 1600 Sessions, the monthly podcast of the White House Historical Association. Today, we're once again in our offices across the street from the White House on historic Lafayette Square. One of the great privileges of my role as president of the White House Historical Association is working with our board of directors, comprised of leaders from various vantage points of success and achievement. And today, I'm really personally excited about our conversation with a key member of our board, Jean Case. I'm sure listeners to this podcast know Jean for her work as CEO of the Case Foundation and the transformational chair of the National Geographic Society. Jean is a philanthropist, an investor, and an internet and impact investing pioneer. Jean has a new book that I'm sure she would like for me to mention, and I certainly want to, and that book will be out in January, and it's titled Be Fearless: 5 Principles for a Life of Breakthroughs and Purpose. And I will say, Jean, it's available for pre-order now, and I've actually ordered my copy on Amazon already.
Thank you, Stuart.
And for today's conversation, I hope Jean will give us a few advanced insights from her book. But to me, I think this conversation will inspire ways that we, the White House Historical Association, and our friends and supporters can continue to shake the dust off of what most people think about when they think about a history organization. You know, one thing, Jean, that I love about my job is teaching and telling the stories of White House history going back to 1792 when George Washington selected that plot of land right out the window across the street from where we are today. And the White House was built, and it's still there as a symbol to the world of American freedom and democracy. And every day in my job, I learn something new. And I know that will be the case, no pun intended, in our conversation today with you, Jean Case. So let's dive in, and thank you, Jean, for being with us today.
Well, let me tell you, Stuart, I've really been looking forward to this day, to this conversation, and as you know, I consider it quite the privilege to be able to serve on the board of this important institution. But I really think of it as a vibrant institution. Institution can make it sound like it's part of, the past or storied or whatever. Yes. But I've been so impressed how relevant it stays and how important it stays even in our modern day.
Well, as you know, the White House Historical Association was founded in 1961 by Mrs. Kennedy, and the principles from that founding are still integral to this unique organization. Jean, tell us what drew you to working with us as an association and what's important to be known about our work and our mission.
Sure. Well, maybe before I talk about, what drew me to the White House Historical Association, I should talk just a bit about my own relationship with the White House through time. Yes. So, as you know, Stuart, I'm a resident of the D.C. area. but that wasn't always so. I first came to the White House from Florida, where I was in high school, and President Carter was president at the time. And I came with the church group to the National Prayer Breakfast, which takes place every year here in Washington. And as part of that, Mrs. Carter invited a group of us to the White House to a reception in the state dining room. And I must tell you, as a young teenager, walking into the White House and being part of that was just so thrilling. I had long been really interested in history, specifically political and military history. And so I'll never forget that day in the White House, walking through the doors and then being present in the state dining room as she hosted us.
And you never would have dreamed as a young teenager that one day you'd be working with the White House Historical Association, collaborating with future First Ladies on maintaining the feel of that house that you experienced as a young woman.
Sure, I had no idea at the time, and then I will say I had the rare privilege of knowing the last 6 administrations. As I said, I first knew President and Mrs. Carter, but then had the opportunity through my career and my life work to work with the following 5 administrations.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I campaigned for President Reagan and had the rare privilege of being given a political appointment by President Reagan when he took office in the early 80s, and so had the chance to be in the White House routinely as part of that. I had met President Bush 41 and Mrs. Bush. I'd worked for a congressman in Florida before working for President Reagan, and he came down and hosted a campaign event. And they were very close, and he served as an important mentor and friend to my boss at the time, Congressman Shaw. So that was really fun. And during those years, I moved career-wise over to technology and helped build the great company known as AOL. Yes. And so through that prism, had the opportunity not only to work with Bush 41 administration, but also President Clinton, who saw a coming internet and connectivity and the democratization of ideas and information that the internet would bring, but grew worried that our public schools were not connected. So we partnered with the Clinton administration and did something called Net Day, where in communities across the United States, we were busy wiring the schools across the nation, and it was an exciting time. And then, under George W. Bush, I had the true privilege of serving in 2 appointed roles, as president of his Service and Civic Participation Council and as co-chair of the U.S.-Palestinian Partnership. And lastly, under the Obama administration, President Obama put forward an initiative called Startup America that was housed at the Case Foundation, and my husband served as its chair. And that really was after the financial crisis, when we were looking across the United States and realizing that investments weren't there the way they had been to grow new companies and new startups, which really make our economy so vibrant. So that work was really making sure that resources were brought to keep that alive.
What a great story of your own personal experience from being a young teenager, your first visit to the White House with Mrs. Carter, and then actively being engaged and seeing up close and personal the workings of the White House and of presidencies. You know, one thing in your story that's compelling to me and relates to the Clintons is I don't think a lot of people realize the role that the White House has played in innovation and technology in our country.
That's right.
Jean, you speak of the transformational integration of the internet, but also, you know, I know Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison and other early innovators in our country used the White House both as a platform and as a portal through which their technologies emerged. And you were riding that wave, Jean, in the Clinton administration to make the internet a real educational tool in our country. And that must have been an exciting experience.
It was, and I give President Clinton a lot of credit for having the foresight to see the transformational power of the internet. But another thing that he and Mrs. Clinton did just before they left the White House was a philanthropy conference. And he was calling on corporate America to commit 1% of what they had to philanthropy. Many things were born out of that, and I'd love at some point, I haven't done this yet, to actually add up or collect what happened because of that one day. It certainly played a huge role in my life, and as you know, my husband and I then created our own family foundation. So, I mean, it was one of those things where it was just one day in the White House, but I think its legacy lives on.
Well, you've spoken about your exposure to various presidents, and that's something that's really special to us and the White House, being the people's house. And our role is really the same from administration to administration. As you know, Talk a little bit about that as to why that is important for us to be a continuity factor.
Sure. Well, one thing I will say hasn't changed in all the years that I've worked, in and around the White House is that it has been a beacon of democracy. And I think one of the things I've come to appreciate is the continuity and the protocol that's so important. And you started by asking me about my own sort of history with the White House. But as you know, my history with the White House Historical Association is fairly new, and I give you credit for helping to educate me about the important work of this organization when I first came to know it just a few years ago. And I was quite struck by the importance of the role, the vision, of course, of Jackie Kennedy originally, but the importance of the role in assuring that sort of continuity, that administrations come and go. That beacon of democracy must be protected, and indeed was designed, as we know, by George Washington to be the people's house. And I think it's been really interesting to watch this nonpartisan organization sit side by side with the White House to protect it and secure it for all time, but also keep it very vibrant and alive and as relevant today as it's ever been.
I do believe that we have had a very important and real public-private partnership with the White House since Mrs. Kennedy in 1961. When I came on board 4.5 years ago now, in some ways I felt like we were a 53-year-old startup at that time because we've been doing really good work, but people didn't know about us. And we've had a great story to tell. So how can we contemporize that message? How can we as an association use the tools and the assets that you work with so closely to not only tell the stories of the White House, but to tell our own story as the White House Historical Association so that it stays fresh and people want to be a part of what we're doing?
Sure. Well, I'd say two things. One is how we talk about the organization, and then what megaphones we use to tell our story. So let's go to how we talk about the organization. You brought it up. Think about it. It was 1961. She was a very young woman when Jackie Kennedy had this vision for what the White House could and needed to be at that time. But she didn't have the resources. And who would ever think a sitting First Lady wouldn't be able to pull together government resources to make that vision a reality? But she brilliantly, and in what I view as a very inspired way, turned to the private sector and asked them to play a role in making that vision a reality. So I think the fact that this is a public-private partnership makes it exceedingly unique, but also assures this ongoing citizen role, because by the private sector being a part of what we do, it will always ensure that that is the people's house. As administrations and politics come and go, that's going to stay continuous. The other piece that I think is really cool about the organization and not talked about enough is, these days the hottest organizations are what we call social enterprises. And, those are places that have the ability to earn money but are mission focused. And here we have this earned income through the merchandise that we sell. Yes. Of course, the first vision being through the White House ornament, but now that has expanded. And for many donors and many investors today, they're looking to basically go to organizations that have more of a sustainable model than just hat in hand every year from their donors. And that's certainly true here, and I think it's really exciting. So between the public-private partnership nature and its social enterprise roots really from its beginning, I think it's a really exciting place.
Even these products that you referenced that we have had the privilege of selling through our shops here in Washington and also online, in fact, earlier this month, we celebrated the 5th anniversary of Mrs. Obama reopening the sales kiosk, the White House sales desk that we had inside the White House itself. So that sales desk in the White House is our first point of being an ambassador with thousands of people a week that come through the White House and have that very first experience like you remember with the Carters. But each of our products, as you know, we try to tell a story with it and have it interpret some part of the White House, an architectural element, something in one of the blue room, the red room, the green rooms, one of the beautiful historic state rooms in the White House. And the White House Christmas ornament is a key example of that. I've often joked, if I'd been in the room in 1981 when someone came in and told Mrs. Reagan that they had this idea for an annual Christmas ornament, I would have thought, okay, fine, do an ornament. But thank goodness they did, because that ornament has done two things since 1981. It's been the foundational bread and butter financially to sustain our organization through times I'm not sure when we would have made it otherwise. And it's been a teaching tool. And education is so important to us. Millions of these ornaments have been sold over the years, and each one contains a booklet, information that educates about the president that it features. And as you know, we feature the president sequentially. We started with George Washington, and in 2018, we feature Harry Truman. So these are wonderful teaching tools. But Jean, what are some ways, and why is it important for us to continue to find fresh ways to engage the citizens of our country, and particularly millennials, the younger citizens of our country, getting them interested and keeping them engaged?
Well, here I have to give you a tremendous amount of credit, because I do think you've made the organization more relevant, particularly with the digital focus that will attract the next generation and engages the next generation. I think our engagement in social media, hundreds of thousands of citizens have been engaged through that, both through, directly responding to some of the things that we put out there, but through those that they share the information with. Yes. I remember you did a Moving Day podcast that started this whole series to talk about what's it like in a White House as one president moves out and another comes in. That was fascinating. Sharing those insights with citizens, I think, is key. But another way, I think, digitally, that you've really made us more relevant and accessible to the next generation, our website today, those very ornaments and merchandise that we were talking about, today is accessible to citizens anywhere, right? How many ambassadors have bought some of the White House-related items to take back home to their countries? And then how many people from other countries have been proud to order something from the United States, as well as citizens everywhere that do that. So, you talked about the power of the ornament and how it has sustained us. We really have to thank citizens, because that is really citizen engagement in supporting the work of the White House when they buy an ornament. And it's a great time of year to be talking about that, right? But the other thing we should talk about is your great vision, and thanks to the generosity of Amazon Web Services, that we have this interactive tour of the White House. One thing I realized in living in Washington, D.C., is just how privileged I am to walk through these great halls that are known across America, but very few citizens will ever have the chance to come and walk through them themselves, right? So this digital or virtual tour that we've made available through the new app is something that I think will keep us not just as relevant, but much more sort of engaged with a generation of Americans unlike we've ever been able to do before.
Well, I know you and I share a great belief in collaboration and in partnerships and in extending our reach. I often say that we are content rich, but reach challenged, and a way to extend our reach is through working with wonderful partners like Amazon Web Services and creating this app, and it's available in the App Store or Google Play. The app is the White House Experience, or WH Experience, and you can use it whether you're in London or you're in Des Moines or you're actually waiting in line to go through the White House itself. As you know, when you tour the White House, they're all self-guided tours, so unless you know what you're seeing, you don't know the historical context. And this tour, through this wonderful app, brings that to life. And there's some actual fun gamification features on it, so I encourage everybody listening, if you've not yet downloaded the White House Experience, the White House app that Jean was talking about, do so today. And we're very grateful to our partners at Amazon Web Services for making this app possible.
We sure are. And let me just tell you a little funny recent story on that, Stuart, that I'm not sure I've shared with you yet. So as you know, I serve on the board of the Women's Policy Initiative at the Bush Institute, where President and Mrs. Bush, of course, are very active. And while I was just down there last week, I had the chance to spend some time with Mrs. Bush. And Anita McBride, who was her chief of staff and is one of our board members here at the White House Historical Association, was with me. And we were showing her the new app. And part of that gamification is where you can take a selfie and it will tell you which first lady you look like. Or president. You can choose either one. So we boldly asked Mrs. Bush to take a selfie and let's see who she ends up looking like. And thankfully, she ended up looking like Laura Bush. But we were nervous there for a few minutes. But we had so much fun. It was a gathering of young Afghan women that Mrs. Bush had brought to the United States as part of a fellowship with the Bush Center. And many of them were doing it. It was really fun. And it's a fun, engaging way, I think, to learn more about White House history.
Well, the app is part of our digital library element of the Rubenstein Center for the Study of White House History, funded and supported by our mutual good friend, David Rubenstein. And I was really frustrated when I came on board here. I'd see our social media post, and the image would be from the Library of Congress or the National Archives. Great organizations. We love those guys. But I knew we had those images too, and why weren't we using our own images? And it was because we couldn't find them. They weren't accessible. Through this wonderful collaboration, which is part of our Amazon Web Services partnership, now we're digitizing our entire collection of unique images of the White House, tens of thousands of these images that are owned and unique to us. And this is for us not to just do our work to add images to our social media and our wonderful work that we do here at the association, but for students and scholars and journalists and authors and others, actually the White House staff, to have access to this treasure trove. You know, we're very excited about this as a key part of our work. I'd like to shift gears now and talk about your upcoming project, Be Fearless, your new book that will be out in January, and the 5 principles that are outlined in your book. Give us the outline and the core and the focus of your book.
Sure. Well, this is based on work that the Case Foundation undertook several years back, basically looking around in our world and the world outside of us, looking back through history and saying, gosh, it feels like a lot of people have set out to do extraordinary things. What's the difference between those that break through and those that don't? And it was out of that these 5 principles emerged, and they're quite constant, whether you go back through history or through contemporary times, and they're quite constant across all sectors, whether it be business, government, nonprofit, even individuals. Products and services, it doesn't matter. So I'll run through them quickly with you, and I think you'll get a sense of what they are.
I'm taking notes here.
The first is make big bets and make history. And the idea there is not to settle for incremental change, but to have really big ideas, big vision, and try and make that sort of your North Star as you move through life. Take risks, experiment early and often. Easy to say, harder to do. Important to check yourself as you move through life. Make failure matter. If you're trying to do something new that's never been done before, or something big and audacious, chances are you are going to trip up along the way. By its very nature, when you try new things, you're not going to bat 1,000. So when failure happens, make it matter. Pick up the lessons, share them with others, and apply them going forward. Reach beyond your bubble, or we say build unlikely partnerships. Ask who's unlike you, who's not at your table, what do you need to bring together to sort of complete the picture and make sure many perspectives and backgrounds are playing a role in what you're trying to take forward. You know, we all appreciate that 2 minds are better than one, but it turns out many minds are better than one, but not just minds just like you, but people that see the world a little differently and can add a different mix. And last but not least is probably my favorite, which is let urgency conquer fear. And there, you know, we think about important moments in history, like Rosa Parks when she got on the bus that day, like Dolly Madison as the White House was burning, and she knew she had to save that Gilbert Stuart portrait of President Washington. Would she have had the nerve to have them break that frame, keep that painting, and flee with it if urgency hadn't played a role?
Well, Gene, those are all powerful. And we have, I believe, as all staff teams should have, a real collaboration among our staff here at the association and also with our board of directors. And you are certainly a key part of that. I look forward to unpacking this book and having a conversation with them. And I'm looking forward to the spring when I have actually thought about giving this as a graduation present to young people. I can't think of a better gift starting a career than to have access to the principles that you outline in this book, or sharing it with professional friends as well. Maybe even anybody thinking of running for office should have this book too.
Well, you know, Stuart, I should point out, although the principles are the heart of the book is a storytelling book. We really make the case that it's ordinary people that achieve extraordinary things. And our hope is that it's an inspiration for people to commit themselves to making a change or making a difference in their world.
And you know, you look at our presidents and our first ladies, from George Washington to President and Mrs. Trump today, and they all come from diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences. And I know that you've had a serious interest in history. And we've talked about that, and I know that you have views on some of these presidents and first ladies from the perspective that you've talked about in your book. I'd love to ask you about that and apply the prism of fearlessness to key people who have been occupants of the White House, this great place in history, the incubator of American history.
Sure. Well, of course, some are better known and some are lesser known, right? But a few of my favorites, I think you really do have to start with the father of our nation, because today we see him as this, storied person who went on to do great things. But we have to remember, America itself was just a startup. It was just an idea. There was an overwhelming power on the globe at that time that we took on. And it would have been so easy to just continue to bring our individual grievances as a colony and just try and make things incrementally a little better. But instead, we had this fearless vision of not only a new nation, but a whole new form of government that really hadn't been seen. So I can't think of someone more fearless than the one that steps into that new role and becomes the leader. But ultimately, why I really am such a fan, aside from the fact that he's a Virginian and I'm a very proud Virginian, the other reason is really based on what he didn't do, which was stay in office.
Yes.
As we know, President Washington cared deeply about sending every signal to say, this isn't a dynasty, this isn't a monarchy, I am not a king. But his decision to step down from office when he still was so wildly popular in the nation really, I think, set a tone for all time about the importance of transitions of power and voluntary transitions of power, which were somewhat unknown in the old world of monarchies. So those things combined, I think, make him very, very fearless. I will also say another one of my favorite presidents to talk about is Teddy Roosevelt. And I don't know if people are aware, he started life not in a position of strength at all. He was a very sickly child. And there's a lot of belief that what made him emerge really as a symbol of youth and vigor and outdoorsman was the very fact that he could do that after spending a big chunk of his childhood not being able to get outdoors and do those active things. But he wasn't just active, as you may know. He was the youngest president ever to serve in the White House at age 42 with a bunch of kids, right? He was a hero of the Spanish-American War with his Rough Riders, but he also was our conservation president. What's really cool about him, he had lost his wife and his mother on the same day. And to get over that, he basically went out west. He went outdoors. I can relate to that. That's what I do when I need to kind of relieve stress or kind of free my mind. But he did it for a couple of years. But even when he was president and he went to Yellowstone, to Yosemite, he would go off on his own with just one or two people. No Secret Service then, no reporters then. He just wanted to go be in the wilderness. And of course, he added so much to America in terms of our preserved public lands. So
his was actually one of the more transformative renovations to the White House.
Yes, that's a really, right? Because of him, we have the West Wing and the Oval Office, right? So yeah, that's just another quality. I do want to talk about a First Lady, and it might be a little unexpected. Anytime I read anything about any First Ladies, I walk away just with my jaw dropped. I just think we've had a remarkable, unbelievable number of First Ladies, and I've really counted a privilege that I've been able to know some of them. But Betty Ford is often not talked about as one of those iconic First Ladies. So I'm a breast cancer survivor, and Betty Ford developed breast cancer while she was First Lady. And we have to remember the time. We can't think about it now. It wasn't something that was talked about. It was almost a taboo subject, right? It had the word breast in it, for goodness sakes. But she was very open about what she was going through. And then she encouraged the following generations and women across America to get screened for breast cancer. The importance of that kind of leadership from a First Lady is often sort of underappreciated, and I just think she really transformed things. But also, I think her fearlessness in dealing with her own problems of addiction and alcoholism after she left office. She created, of course, the Betty Ford Center. It's estimated that over 100,000 people have been treated through the Betty Ford Center. But that all happened because she was bold enough to take on an area where many could have just, tried to silence it or hang their head in shame. But instead, she was very public about it and then built a great institution to deal with that challenge others others would face as well. And then, of course, during her time, she was a great champion for the Equal Rights Amendment. And at a time when it wasn't so popular for first ladies to be outspoken in that way. So in many ways, she was just fearless and ahead of her time. So I want to just give her a nod. And then lastly, of course, I mentioned I have the privilege to work with the Bush Center. I want to talk about President George W. Bush. I mentioned that principle of reach beyond your bubble or build unlikely partnerships. You know, when President Bush came into office, there was a terrible disease ravaging Africa, taking away a generation of Africans. Tens of millions were suffering from AIDS. At that time, only about 50,000 had access to any kind of therapies. And he saw it as an absolute imperative to do something about that. So he brought together maybe what I considered one of the most unlikely partnerships I've ever seen. I had the privilege of being in the Roosevelt Room as the idea of PEPFAR was being developed.
PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief.
Correct. Thank you for that, Stuart. Using those Washington acronyms I try to avoid, but that's exactly what it is. And he had an idea that he would put together a very large initiative to address this, but he knew he needed the support of citizens across the land. And at that time, there was a great degree of controversy over whether we should play a role in providing AIDS relief in Africa. So, you know, to my left, I had some of the heads of the AIDS relief organizations who were, you know, really arguing for using condoms as a solution. To my right, I had leaders from the Catholic Church saying you cannot use condoms. Across the table, I had, you know, people from the Christian right. We had heads of pharmaceutical companies where we were saying they have to be affordable. So it was this unlikely mix of people who really didn't agree about most things. And I talk about this in the book, by the way, that important moment in the White House in the Roosevelt Room. But what I saw happen was, in the end, I think it was the compassion we all felt and the need to let urgency conquer fear, to do some uncomfortable things and find compromise. And of course, that's what happened, and a $15 billion AIDS relief package was put together under the leadership of President Bush. And, you know, it's estimated that between 10 and 20 million lives have been saved in Africa because of that. But that only happened because people who really didn't agree agreed to come together in a room and find solutions. And it was a fearless moment for President Bush. He didn't have to do it. It wasn't his nation that he was really looking after. And yet, probably, in my mind, it will be among the most enduring legacies of his presidency.
Well, those are powerful examples of being fearless, Jean, and I appreciate your personal perspective on those. And it comes to mind as you talk through these things that leadership, the actions, the boldness that each of them demonstrated, whether it was a personal nature with Betty Ford or global nature with George W. Bush, they did this through a platform called the White House. And this privilege they had been given to lead our nation, and that symbol of the White House of American freedom and democracy, as I mentioned earlier, of compassion with the AIDS work, of inspiration through mental health issues or breast cancer, the breast cancer issue. There are billions of people around the world to whom that house is a symbol of freedom, democracy, hope, inspiration. And these are billions of people who will never come to our country. They'll never visit the White House. And most of them will probably never even meet an American. But they know the symbol and the meaning of that house. And it's not just the men and women who have been our presidents and first ladies, but the White House staff, those wonderful people who work from president to president, no matter who may be the temporary occupant as first family. In other podcasts, we've peeled back the curtain a little bit and talked about the various roles that support a president and a first lady, and who work very closely with the people in the White House to keep the House to a certain standard every single day, so it can be the stage upon which our most important visitors are received and transformational actions are taken. So it's a pretty incredible place, and I love your reference to what George Washington didn't do. You know, he could have been king, and in picking this plot of land and in building this house, he didn't envision a grand European palace. He envisioned a house that would be important, but would also be appropriate for our country. And I think we have the privilege of working day in and day out in this public-private partnership with the White House to keep it in that context that George Washington originally envisioned, but also keep it to the standard that Mrs. Kennedy and others that followed her envisioned for it as well. So, Jean, this has really been an exciting conversation for me to have with you today, and we'll be releasing this through a season of Thanksgiving in our country, actually initially released on Giving Tuesday, and we're so grateful here in America for the many blessings that we have, and I'm certainly personally grateful for those who support our work in many ways, not just financially, but also purchasing our annual White House Christmas ornament, reading our books, listening to this podcast every month, visiting our White House Visitor Center, which is really an important asset here in Washington. And we're really grateful for those who support us like you do, Jean. And as we close now and as we leave our listeners during this season of Thanksgiving, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I do. You know, we live in what many perceive as a very divided time. This is a very unique institution. You spoke in one of the previous podcasts, Stuart, with one of your guests about how remarkable it is if you think of what America was like in 1800 as people moved into the first White House to today. There were 5 million citizens in 1800. There's 325 million today. There were a handful of states. Today we have 50 states and territories. We're a global power. And yet the continuity and the protocol that has been with that beacon of democracy over at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue has remained the same. And that is because of the work of this institution. It transcends politics, it transcends any one president or first lady, and it's the reason we get to continue to enjoy it the way that we do for citizens everywhere. So if I would say anything in closing, for those listening out there, you know, we're coming up on the holiday season. We do have this extraordinary ornament, which brings with it the story of the White House and a presidency. This year it's President Truman. That's a great way to support the organization at this time of year. But generally speaking, I would say tap into all of the things that we've talked about. Follow us on social media. Come to our website. We hope you have the chance. If you can't physically tour the White House, take that virtual tour. That's right. But find some way to engage with us if you're out there. And I can tell you from someone who has supported this organization for some time now, I really can't speak highly enough of what a great cause it is in a divided time to see this nonpartisan organization transcend politics and keep that beacon of democracy secure.
Wow, thanks, Jean. I started out saying I anticipated being inspired by this conversation, and I know that I really have been, and I'm sure that our listeners to the 1600 Sessions have been as well. Thank you all for listening. I know that we all have many things to be grateful for in this season of Thanksgiving, and I'm personally grateful for the privilege of this role, the great team of colleagues I have here at the White House Historical Association, our wonderful board of directors, our National Council on White House History, and many other friends and supporters, and even the listeners to this podcast. And we hope that you will all dive into our books this holiday season when you're at home with your family and enjoy this 2018 White House Christmas ornament, which everyone should have. You can get it at whitehousehistory.org. It's the perfect Christmas gift. And to all of our listeners, I'd like to wish a safe and happy holiday season with friends and family, and to thank you for your support of our organization and for listening to the 1600 Sessions.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And you can help others find this podcast by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again to Jean Case. And thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.